All right, Karla, welcome back.
Thank you.
How are you feeling?
I'm slightly nervous and apprehensive because one does not normally speak in front of an audience, but I really appreciate your coming and yeah.
All right, well, we'll work that. I don't know if you're making me nervous or
No,
if
I
I'm
think there's
just
a general
nervous.
anxiety and in the work in any case, so
Okay.
I'm just matching the tone.
All right. Well, we'll see what we can do in the first sort of 5 minutes. Dispense some of the anxiety, and then I don't know, get into it. So Eugene Thacker, we talked about him and his work, and there is some influence of his, I guess, philosophical ideas in the works. I picked out his book from I think 2011, "In the Dust of This Planet," and read some of that. And there was an interesting quote in the preface, which I'll start with. And he writes, "The world is increasingly unthinkable. A world of planetary disasters, emerging pandemics, tectonic shifts, strange weather, oil-drenched seascapes, and the furtive, always looming threat of extinction. In spite of our daily concerns, wants, and desires, it is increasingly difficult to comprehend the world in which we live and of which we are a part. To confront this idea is to confront an absolute limit to our ability to adequately understand the world at all." I mean, sounds grim, but there's something that I noticed in that quote that I'd like to pick out, and it's this notion that the world is increasingly unthinkable, and that it's increasingly difficult to comprehend. So I want to ask you, do you think it's accurate to say increasingly? And do you think there was ever a time when the world was simple enough to be comprehensible?
I mean, I can't speak to other moments in time, and other than just my own direct experience that
Sure.
We are, a generation that was kind of born and, formed in like the 80s and 90s when the world felt like that it was quite linear in terms of like globalization and, progress, being conceived as, yes, necessarily like with more information, somehow we could like steer and resolve problems with a certain kind of logic. And like, obviously that's a fallacy and has never existed in history. There's always cycles of populism and whatnot that to take you off course, and things are never going to have that kind of coherent kind of stability. But like, we've just learnt that, I mean, at least as in terms of lived experience, there's quite large kind of economic and global kind of shocks, and being the first generation to kind of see the impasse of looming existential threat and the kind of inadequacies of government to necessarily kind of reckon with that, let alone kind of create any kind of logical solutions towards it. So I think that's a sense of like a lack of agency of how to steer coherent outcomes and to be able to fix what is a literal existential crisis. Like, people use the phrase existential crisis very lightly, but it is actually, apparent. And I think that's very much kind of influencing a generation of kind of pessimism. And so you do see a lot more kind of like pop psychology and very much kind of dealing with like the realms of nihilism and hopelessness. And then, but then what to do with it is like, the question, and how to create some agency. If you don't have it in the world, how to then create it in other communities or other sectors.
I like how you, you reference your own experience, which makes sense, right? As opposed to speaking or responding to this question across the entire, I guess, range of history. And I like that you say, there's a generation which, I take to be our generation, where in the 80s and 90s, it seemed linear, it seemed that, progress was possible. I do wonder whether that might not be just a consequence.
That's fallible as well. Like, that's
not that it's fallible, but as a result of our perhaps youth at the time and naivete at the time. I wonder if people in their, 40s at the time thought the 80s were really tough. Because referencing history, I think we find that there are always these periods where people feel like it could be the end of the world.
Sure. I mean, look at like this upheaval in like the 60s and 70s in terms of like political assassinations and huge economic, depression. Like inflation and these problems have existed. It's not to kind of glorify that this is a period beyond, suffering. We don't have to make a comparable kind of note there. It's just, I can only speak of my direct experience, kind of distilled through, my time and place.
So then if we take that perhaps individual lives kind of have this high point or low point of complexity, difficulty to comprehend, what are you making of it at this time in your life, and how does that express itself in some of these works?
Even like the differential of saying like the phases of highs and lows, and maybe that's kind of a bit of a misnomer in and of itself. Maybe it is just like holding a tangled web of complexity, and that's actually how one actually just navigates life. That there is no kind of particular kind of binary of particular solutions. There's no clear answers, and I guess like in living a life within the kind of the lens and framework, kind of navigating it through art practice, you're kind of primed for that way of looking and holding contradictions and complexity just in the way that you orientate yourself in the world, but also how you conduct yourself within art practice as well. Like there is this constant rhizomatic thread of influences and readings, and maybe through deep space time, through history and other knowledge systems that you are kind of always drawing on to kind of make sense of your immediate moment. So it's not necessarily so directly linear. There's breadth and web of how to orientate connections. And
so are there any particular works in the exhibition that kind of come out of this reckoning or grappling with complexity, or would you say it's a sort of pervasive throughout
the totality?
Okay.
So I mean, like each body of work, it's anchored in a kind of conceit with the still life genre, which I've had various kind of iterations as to how that's kind of been able, a language through which for me to try and unpack some, different points of concern at different kind of phases. So it kind of feels strange to kind of drop in it in the most recent work, as I see it as a kind of continuum of pretty much a 10-year project, by this stage.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to point, specifically.
Okay, it's just there.
What's in front of us. Yeah.
Okay. So you shared with me, and I hope it's okay for me to say this, but we'll find out, that you're the youngest of 7 siblings.
True.
And by the time you were born, there was an existing family system into which you were thrown. I find a certain depth in the way you speak about that, because one doesn't have to be faced with planetary disasters, pandemics, climate change, and geopolitical tectonic shifts.
Just being born
to experience. That's right. To experience a world that doesn't make sense, right? One can just simply be born with 6 older siblings.
Or just the cruelty and strangeness of being born and grappling with consciousness.
Yeah. Because I find the world rather complex as well. So you're the youngest of 7. I'm the eldest of 3, so birth order perhaps maybe doesn't matter.
No, but I understand. We did speak about this, and basically as being quite foundational as to why I've been gravitating towards the still life, and like that being the kind of natural language that I've orientated myself towards. And like very kindly have a brother here this evening, and my dad Franco's at the back. So as to how much I speak about family, we'll glean some parts. But no, I think yes, being the youngest of 7, there was this like fascination of being born into a system that you didn't quite understand what was this ecosystem and how all these like relationships formed, and what was this order or this system that you've been trying to kind of understand. How did things end up the way that they became? And we're a wonderful family of hoarders, and we don't throw anything out, which I find completely endearing. So it was this idea of kind of investigating through the embodied memories of objects that I didn't have firsthand memories of, but was kind of using that as a means of projection, as to kind of fill gaps of knowledge in. And that became like just like a way of looking, in a way, to unpack these museum kind of relics to lives that you don't have necessarily access to, but you have a deep emotional connection to, and also a fantasy projection of what it means and what they stand in for in a broader kind of system.
Yeah. That makes sense. What's the age gap from the eldest to you?
15.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's a very much established family system by the time you show up. So what are some of your early recollections of maybe, little Karla's going around and trying
just
to
going
make
through
sense?
everyone's drawers.
Oh,
Just like literally just like rifling it and then just like trying to figure out like.
Do any of the objects, stand out for you from that time?
One that comes to mind, so we've got a constantly evolving garden, which maybe there's a tenet of that with my father's ability to migrate plants from one part of the garden to another part of the garden and they immediately die. But there's a cyclical kind of force of
right.
how garden is curated. But there was a particular tree in the front terrace where there used to be bonfires back in the day when that was allowed, but not in my time. But there was this like one tree that was completely scarred, and it was just like such a kind of visual kind of metaphor that like some trauma, something had happened here, and the tree trying to repair itself around the trunk. But I had no obviously memory of this, what would have been a very dramatic event,
sure,
or what was the framework around that. So like things like that when things were had a patina or had a sense of age or.
Is the tree still there?
Oh no, Dad chopped it down. It's like
okay.
Again, constantly evolving destruction and cycle of death and redemption in that garden.
Okay. I can see some of it. So coming back to this notion of incomprehensibility, and we talked about, I guess you can view it through a macro lens and how it unfolds throughout history, but of course it has probably more meaning for us at the micro level, perhaps because it's painful at that level. Events such as betrayal in a relationship, the death of a child, the loss of position or prestige are just some ways in which people experience personal suffering. And it makes no sense, personal suffering. It just happens. So I want to ask you, what do you do with your own personal suffering when there is no meaning, and how do you work it through?
Well, maybe, yes, from that kind of point of disillusion and disbelief that has come, with just reckoning of how being alive, I would say the practice in and of itself is maybe trying to manufacture hope and searching for connection through a particular kind of like material process and conceptual process, for that matter. And I guess like kind of the neatness and linearity of trying to resolve your problems with an XYZ equation, has always, been proven to be fallible. So it's like, how then to, I don't know, form a lens of being in the world that you actually create the meaning through process and not outcome, because you've got no sense of control in terms of like, where work is placed. Once it leaves your studio, it develops its own life, but even more philosophically as well, like that you do not have any sense of control once you're in community, once you're involving other people. So like you have to ground yourself in some kind of like narrative and storytelling. Yeah. And like I would say that feeling like personally somewhat disconnected and alienated by the world, I find this kind of like manufacturing of hope through connection, but this is like a personal conversation that I've always mediated through engaging in artwork and using that as a conversational mirror back to myself and allowing that to be a rich text to unpack time and unpack space. And like oftentimes, that is mediated through the poetry of materials or the semiotics of language, but engaging in that kind of very personal conversational framework between me and the conduit of an artwork. And I've very much kind of framed like through my kind of maximalism and acidic conceit of like hypersaturation and like way too much to kind of to hold and look at, using that conceit to try and invite the audience in to be in that same physical proximity to kind of read the embodied presence of the artist in the work and be in that direct conversation, even if it's metaphysical. And like that's really important for me to slow people down as I slow myself down, through the act of art making and painting.
So there's a lot there. I want to explore a little bit more deeply this idea of conversation, right? Conversation through process. So when you're making the work, there's no one else there but you. So there's a sense in which you're having a conversation with yourself. And then when the works leave the studio, at that point, you start to have a conversation with others. Can you tell us a bit about the conversations with yourself? Like the eyes.
I mean, you see the madness of my brain. It's all very much laid to bear here. Like, welcome to the theatrics of my inner life. Yeah.
What are some of the things that you've said to yourself as you?
I don't think that's safe for an audience, though. That's pretty self-flagellating. So.
Okay, all right, we get the idea.
Yeah, there's a certain punishment, and like there's a certain self-scrutiny as well. Because like if I'm only feel like I have license to speak about my own autobiographical experience, like by necessity, it involves such a process of self-examination, which is not exactly a pleasant place to sit and reside in. It's like a deep sense of like analysis of your place in the world. It doesn't allow for rest.
Okay. So then, if that's the conversation you're having with yourself, by the time the works leave the studio and now we're having a conversation with the works, is there anything you might like us to take away, or what do you want to say?
No, I'm not sure. I mean, it exists on many different levels, and I don't expect my access point to the work to be necessarily what's shared in a public audience. But like, I would hope in like the worlds that I'm creating, at least as like, for as much as like I'm grappling with a certain amount of kind of existential nihilism, there's also like respite in levity and humor, and like things are absurd, so like why not drive it off the cliff and have some fun with it along the way? And I've really reframed in recent years to anchor myself in process and having a lot more kind of space for joy and for chance in the process of the making, which I almost have to construct and trip myself up to do. Like allowing there to be like following different tangents, and like if it can make me like burst out laughing, it's the most joyful kind of aspect of the work. So like for as much as you're kind of holding the seriousness of just what it means to exist at this time and place and get by, there's also great chances for releasing that pressure valve and just like having comedic moments and having delight, and curiosity with the visual, with the color, and that alone is enough to kind of not fall into despair.
You used the term before, I really like to manufacture hope, and we've talked previously about this notion of optimistic nihilism, which seems an oxymoron, but it's not. How would you say that through your process there is a manufacture of hope?
You've got to spin yourself a story of why to do anything. Why would you engage in what, this art practice can be a toxic relationship at times. Like you are basically kind of convincing yourself that, it is, it's worth following a certain amount of your curiosities, distill them and make something, of them. And I tell myself constantly, like I'm grounded in a fundamental curiosity of like what color, what mark and gesture can do. Like, and from that, it becomes kind of based in language. But like to give yourself a story is like, why is it worth, making an exhibition that for 5 months you're painting 12 to 14 hours a day and having distance in your emotional, lives. You have to give yourself a story of like, why is it worth investing in? And like this becomes like a bit of a false promise in a way of an idea that can never necessarily be achieved in its outcome. And there's always by necessity a kind of drop when it leaves the studio, because there's never a sense of like resolution that you're never going to fully be able to express all your ideas in any body of work. What you're doing is trying to invite a continuum and invite us like a story that there's a level of hope that through work begets new work, and you're always going to find the thread of connection to take you on your next. And that's a way to kind of avoid the crushing despair of not necessarily achieving, all that you had in that initial story of like why to make this collection or why to explore these ideas in the first place.
I want to ask you something, but I also don't want to, because maybe it's not the place. But I'm going to ask it, and then just don't answer. Just don't answer me. Do you ever find hope as opposed to the manufacturer?
I think this is an incredibly hopeful body of work, really, because there is still a yearning for connection, despite having not found it. So there is an invitation there for, I guess, with some of like the imagery having, played with some eco-horror tropes, but allowing that space to be there for generative possibility, like new hybridity, new possibilities. And that also comes through the very foundation, like the fact that I'm using, material, and that's got an infinite sense of possibility as well. even though I end up defying the dream of making a mark differently than I've ever made before. Like I always think and hope that I'll be able to have some ethereal open edges and allow paint just to be paint, and I constantly tighten and close up and have just like such a kind of distinct set of like boundaries and edge, and I'm looking for a certain freedom in the work that is part of like something I'm chasing towards or looking to find.
Sure.
But yes, inevitably you get in your own way time and time again.
It's like this cycle of hope and despair.
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to read something. It's just a small excerpt from an essay by Ronald Aronson on Camus. And he summarizes Camus' philosophy of the absurd as follows, right? So Camus argues that human beings cannot escape asking the question, what is the meaning of existence? Camus, however, denies that there is an answer to this question and rejects every scientific, teleological, metaphysical, or human-created end that would provide an adequate answer. Thus, while accepting that human beings inevitably seek to understand life's purpose, Camus takes the skeptical position that the natural world, the universe, and the human enterprise remain silent about any such purpose. Since existence itself has no meaning, we must learn to bear an irresolvable emptiness. This paradoxical situation, then, between our impulse to ask ultimate questions and the impossibility of achieving any adequate answer, is what Camus calls the absurd. So just a bit of a definition of the absurd. Is Camus' definition of the absurd, which is to look for meaning where there is none.
I mean, to look for it, but it's not about getting an answer either. I mean, that's the invitation there.
Yeah.
Is to allow this just to be like you are creating a sense of meaning, through the lens of how you, go exist through the world, and what you choose to do with it, which I was just talking about, like, there not being necessarily the sense of like a finality of like, I'm not looking for an end point in terms of material outcomes. With the work. It's very much refocused on like the joys of, the rhizomatic threads of like what influences and what glimmers, kind of stay with you. And that's really important to kind of, like, that's where the magic resides. It's like you've created, a system of problems, and there are, material and conceptual, solutions, but it's never solved. Like, it's never an end point. It's literally just like tapping into a kind of a different kind of resonance of your thinking. Like, you're not just using your logical mind, you're using all your senses and like letting that kind of guide you. And like, I don't know if there could be anything more to make you feel more alive, in a way than that kind of being completely embedded in creative problem solving.
Sure.
But it's not tangible,
Yeah. So you would just say this looking for something that may not be able to be found.
Listening, as well, like rather than necessarily taking in the outputs of what's around you, a slowness and maybe a certain amount of remove and how you engage in the world, and the quietness of looking that's just for you, and you're creating your own idiosyncratic language in terms of what you save, what you archive, what you create your own personal kind of metaphors and stories around. Like, that's meaning. It doesn't necessarily amount to anything with virtue to it, but like, that's the closest I can imagine having a delight, of the absurd and not knowing.
Sure. And would you say it drives pretty much your entire practice?
Yes. Yeah. I'm entertaining myself the entire time, just looking for my little cues, like the investigative going through people's drawers. I'm still doing that in a more kind of a world sense.
Okay. You sent me a short essay on your process. And in that essay, you write, and I quote, "There is a psychological divorce as soon as my paintings leave the studio."
First sentence, all right, yes. That essay.
Yeah, but it struck me when we talked about it as well. Because I find, this step in your professional sequence, and I call it professional sequence because it seems as like, the point when the paintings leave is when you have to enter this other world, right? The world of commerce, the world.
Open despair as well, like that you have to kind of divorce yourself from it because you've got no control over that. So it's about reframing where success lies.
Yeah.
And I know, as I spoke about, like, I'm incredibly hard on myself. Like, I do kind of discredit everything that I've just achieved to create space, to chase the new kind of glimmers of invention. And I'm what begets the, the next work is basically the dissatisfaction of what I had, what I couldn't achieve in that particular body of work. So there is a kind of a purging of the lack of successes, or what I've seen is that. And it takes me a long time to, have enough emotional distance to kind of be able to see, what was actually valuable and what was actually developed in that most immediate body of work.
Can I inquire into that a little bit? I'm really curious about it because I haven't heard any artists talk about it this way. Maybe they feel this way, but we certainly haven't touched on it.
But surely it's like the cycle of the toxicity of a relationship. You're just going to have to give yourself a pause and time to kind of bring in new ideas and impetus.
Yeah, but it reminds me of, and I don't know to what extent this is true, but in, I don't know, the Middle Ages, when people used to have lots of children, but not all of them would make it to maturity, then the parents would not get too attached to the children in the first kind
only a recent invention. It's only a couple of centuries old.
Yeah, but in the first sort of 3-4 years of life. And it feels similar, right? It's like, and you even said on a chat we had, I have to kill my darlings,
But you don't want to get too attached, because it's, again, I'm trying to find my practice, and that's really important for me to frame my practice as trying to find it. And I hope I almost never do.
But I guess what I'm asking, which because I haven't asked yet, is what would be the risk of being attached to the works as they leave the studio?
Well, much like human beings, that's where hurt gets involved. Sure.
Would you risk it?
I mean, I've got some fond ones that I come back to. Again, it's not like I'm without them forever. It's a cooling off period. It's not so much like they're not going to a pile to be burnt,
right.
martyred. If we're using the medieval analogies. No, there's some that I absolutely return back to.
Okay.
With seeing that there were seeds of thought that I was just a bit too close to see at that point in time, and they've certainly you'll revisit what you need to glean from them if it kind of holds in your memory long enough.
And so you let them all go, and then some of them make it back.
Sure, but also looking at this body of work, I've used a kind of aesthetic device of kind of framing the compositions within a pretty kind of theatrical trope, with it all kind of sitting on one kind of theater plane with unconventional kind of lighting, and everything kind of sits in a really kind of flat two-dimensional register.
Yeah.
And all I want to do now is to isolate some forms and actually allow more kind of spatial breadth and depth. So it just creates that really counterbalance of what I couldn't achieve in one body of work, and I might have kind of twisted to a certain extremity. It's just time for a bit of a rest and reset to kind of create new developments, very much even in a practical sense of chasing even on in a very formal way of how can I develop my compositions and paint handling differently, how can I build my surfaces differently, because that's always that very first anchor point of that seed of curiosity, and that it gets me excited. And that's that kind of sense of manufacturing hope that I've got to go back to a kind of a formal conceit of where to develop, and that becomes the branching out. And I kind of tend to contextualize my work as a bit of a back-end approach as well. It's not actually the seeds of how I start. I kind of, again, chase glimmers in a way, whether that be a material conceit or a formal thing I want to practice, and then kind of let, different authors and other things just kind of naturally kind of appear to kind of flush out and kind of guide, a collection. But I only really use language at the tail end to actually understand what I've actually done.
Sure.
Yeah. Which is a bit of a distancing kind of trope as well, because it's not how I come to it. There's a finality of writing that final artist statement and then giving you space to start the next
divorce.
Yeah.
I had a little reflection here about agency and control, but I kind of want to go into it, but at the same time I don't. So I might just ask, do these terms sit closely for you, or do you find that they're kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum?
I'm not sure, because I would say that there is a searching for freedom in the work, because because I hold myself with a certain kind of self scrutiny, and of where can that be found. And as I was kind of referencing, that I ended up controlling and tightening my edges, that it does feel like this concept that feels out of grasp, in terms of being able to find it. But there is a small act of rebellion by being an artist in a hyper-capitalistic world that doesn't necessarily, hold space for artists like, they once did in other times and places. So there is in a world that you have such lack of control, having the kind of agency to still make against that. That's the space of freedom, I guess, in the work, is the doing of it and prioritizing that in your life.
Good. So there's a balance of both agency.
Well, it's a manufactured sense of freedom, manufactured hope. So
let's talk about some of the work itself, right? So there are some themes that come through. Critique of being human at this point in history. Can you take us through maybe some of the pieces and where you draw that out?
Sure. I guess it's funny. It's like I spend, when I'm working, I am, painting between like 8 and 14 hours a day, and I don't listen to music when painting. It's always just a sociological critique of like different academics, speaking to me about history, politics, whatever. Like I've got a little pet project was geopolitics, until obviously things have gotten way too absurd for that to be a kind of coherent soundscape. But that all filters, into my mind when making the work. So it's funny if you could kind of like, given the fact that, each work takes how many, hours, to make those embedded kind of knowledges of like what one is grappling with the most current, debates or history.
So that's really interesting. So we kind of get a lot of podcasts.
But like the work that you're familiar with and own, the Sense of an Ending, for example, which was a couple of shows ago, and I was kind of looking much more like formally at Dutch impossible bouquets, which we could unpack in terms of its relationship to Western world views and capitalism. But that body of work, for example, very much like started as a kind of a sense of kind of analyzing kind of individualism and capitalism and getting by. But because I went on such a deep dive of like pre-World War I and World War I history, it ended up in like with these like nihilist black holes and really kind of existential dread by the end of it. So
literal black holes
and narcissist pools that turned into it went on the journey. So it was like there's a subconscious influence as well of like what I'm processing, of just being in the world.
Right. So then, how, as consciously as you can tell us, do you interweave ideology, autobiography, pathos, and humor into the work?
I mean,
does it just happen, or
no? I mean, we live in the world. Like it's there to be unpacked. It's just, it depends as the audience how much you want to unpack the text. But inadvertently, like it has to function from autobiography, or else like why would it be mine to make? So there has to be a way in my relationship of what I'm grappling and what I'm thinking about. So like, yes, the autobiography becomes very coded. It's my own idiosyncratic language. I don't expect an audience to be able to distill, what codes and reads for me in terms of my, subjective experience. And then like, it's like that sense of like thinking about it as a text that broadens out. So it's just creating of context around it, and like, that sense of kind of deconstruction in the work is apparent.
But would you say it's quite active, or again much more subliminal and kind of subconscious as it
I think it's just like the lens in which how I view the world is a very kind of deconstructionist kind of mentality of just trying to understand things and unpack things and see and hold the complexity of. And yes, there's a pathos and humor. It's like I want there to be a warmth to the work. I don't want it to be like so austere. I want to invite people in and to the conversation and hold space. And that can't be held with too much kind of sorrow and despair. You've got to come in and have a party, and even if it is a fruit, that's about to rot and on the cusp of decay, and end times are near. But we can have a good time on the way out.
Okay, let's talk about some of the technical elements. I mean, you told me about maximalism and the 2D nature of the compositions. I might not have seen it had you not said so. So I think, it might be worth taking people through that.
Sure. Yeah. I would say that very much comes from the archive, like the actual process of like how, like instead of keeping an art diary and notations, it's literally just like a digital like database of constantly saved images and references. And that's like a daily practice of screenshotting whatever is like weird, fascinating, strange, as well as like site visits to, botanical gardens and whatnot. But like, it's that cataloging that creates through a very kind of like visual collage, way of actually how I approach what my compositions will end up being.
Mm-hmm.
So every time I start a body of work, yes, there are certain kind of glimmers and little threads to follow, but I spend at least like a month of just like re-archiving and re-subfoldering, images and whatnot, just to kind of distill like a kind of Grensfeld experiment of like images flashing over my eyes and just like seeing what kind of impregnates and what sticks. And then I kind of create little subfolders when I have the intentions for certain compositions to kind of distill what elements could create some interesting kind of relationships, whether that be formal or metaphorically. And then the process, I don't like to preconceive my compositions too heavily, whereas I used to do a lot of like photoshopping prior to, and then just kind of beam them up and paint more formally. But I've had to trick myself up for a space of invention. And rather now I just project individual elements and collage on top of each other. That becomes this complete tangled mess, which is this point of possibility of like what to then come to the fore, what to leave, regressive in the background, but then this space of just literal invention. So like all of the flora and fauna are both real and imagined, or have the possibility to be, which is that sense of it becoming its own entity.
Sure. But with everything, it's like everything is in the foreground, right?
Yeah, in this particular body of work, I've very much like used like theatre tropes, as I was saying, the idea of like it all sitting on one particular plane and having a kind of like a certain kind of aesthetic anxiety of like not allowing your eyes to rest or necessarily penetrate with any depth, and like sit in that a little bit of a reverberation,
right?
Like to kind of get that pulsating sense of
because the intensity is there.
Neurotic energy. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So in this in the exhibition essay, you close with this statement. See, I quote you as you start, I quote you as you finish.
Oh, I'm happy to be quoted. Like Camus and I usually.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
And it's on record. So in this mix of horror and delight, there is hope, a chance to imagine a future that embraces change, hybridity, and collaborative creation. But these lessons are slow to reveal themselves. And for me, they are best explored through the act of painting. What are the lessons?
Gift of time, to not know, and to hold the not knowing, and to hold that complexity without it feeling overwhelmed. And that is done by slowing things down, going back to like literally like there's pigment on a brush, and that in and of itself has its own kind of like sense of poetry and agency too, and you were there to kind of dance and collaborate with that, and trying to detangle how you think through the act of doing.
There's like ultimate,
which is generative, and that's where the hope comes from. You're not just sitting and doing nothing with it. You are making from something that didn't exist, now exists, and it's there to share. And that seems like a really hopeful endeavor.
Okay. I want to end it there, but I have a cheeky question. So I'm going to.
An elegant way to finish that.
I know. So let's make like it's finished.
Okay, sure.
And then I'll reserve.
This is the postscript.
Yeah, the postscript. Can you tell us about the vulvas in the work? And like I've wondered, and I've got the one.
He counts everywhere. It's true. Like again, for my humor, like it's like, let's say like the conversations I have with art are not all highfalutin. Some of them are just pretty base. And like when I go around to see, I was like in Antwerp and Brussels like earlier this year. And what is my screen, my photos of all of the Dutch still lives are all of the cut melons that look fairly vaginal and yes.
Like this one, yeah.
But like.
Is that a goala?
Yeah, with teeth.
Yeah.
I mean the work, what to say, it's like.
Very good.
So it's good to, that sense of cheekiness. Not everything has to be like,
Derrida and deconstruction.
Exactly right. Yeah. Sometimes it is just a teenager having a joke, and that's a good time too.
That's great. Look, Karla, thank you so much. I'll open to the audience if anyone has questions or comments.
We can also just hang out a little bit after and have some conversations rather than being. Please.
Going back to the hurricane.
Yeah, like the anti-still lives.
Yeah, anti-still lives, chaos.
And
painting that chaos being photographed. You didn't elaborate on the chaos. Now you're painting chaos deliberately. So that seems to me.
Yeah, I'm still like super interested in like the idea of the pile as well, of like, you know, like that as a kind of sculptural form that it both hides and reveals simultaneously. And I would say like in these worlds, I'm both hidden and revealing, you know, myself, and like maybe like more directly making a nod in reference to that with some like the weird eyes that I kind of portraying myself, you know, through the landscape. So taking that to a bit more of a humorous, you know, kind of anchor.
Yeah, I see more of your addition.
Yeah.
But I also see the structure of the original.
Sure.
Of that the chaos.
And like the abstract potential of like of a pile, because like things, objects are obstructed and just then can just exist as geometry and shape, and that's super exciting too, that it can function both in realism but like formally in abstraction too. Yeah.
So this body of work, did you say it took 5 months or so?
Yeah, madness. Yeah.
So,
Right.
so you collected a bunch of ideas in your portfolio as reference material and so on. But when you're making a body of work like this, do you stick to one pattern, like work on one painting?
Oh no, work on them all simultaneously. So it's important. Okay, so it's different stages simultaneously, let's say that rather. Like, so I can't have blank canvases around the studio. So everything has to have the mid-tonal underpainting from whatever color that is. And I need to kind of see the totality of the exhibition at scale before I can kind of just like zone in and like, you know, knock them off kind of one by one.
So it leads to my question. You don't go from one to the other to the other, like the complete one.
And the language also evolves in that too. Like when we watch, you know, what to bring to the fore, there are certain motifs that I'm not necessarily preconceiving that they will actually become the story. So there's also a space for things to, you know, the process and the concepts to emerge through seeing it and imagining it and actually reflecting on these like tangled webs and actually spending time in that complexity too, to kind of listen deeply to what the painting wants to be as well. So it's not so dictatorial in terms of, you know, knowing what it's going to be at that top end.
Yes, which sort of leads to like how you come up with the concepts. Do you, before you start the body of work, do you have a fairly good concept of what each painting will be, or
little whispers?
One influence the next one,
like a chain.
Grow as it goes.
It does grow as okay. I think in the pre-development it grows.
It's both.
Yeah.
It doesn't be so binary.
Yeah, it depends. Like, so there are a number of works here are from a preceding body of work, and like it was 2023, and then most of these works are 2024. I guess it just depends on like how strong are the conceptual conceits around the framework that can maybe anchor certain decision making. So in the 2023 body of work, I was very much looking at Max Ernst and like early surrealism in terms of taking these organic structures and sitting them within a kind of as a sculpture anchored against a kind of landscape. And that was, yes, I was looking at certain kind of eco-nihilism and eco-horror tropes when developing that body of work. And I guess in the work that I did this year, it didn't have that kind of pre-development of looking at kind of different academic texts and having that to help narrow the gaze. It's just, it was much more kind of emo and emotional, and just in terms of like me grappling with the concept of living between two locations. And yeah, I don't know if it was, I guess it's just a process of like, you're just thinking visually, you know, for a while in terms of like where to necessarily take them. It's not, yeah, it's an ongoing process, but it's not also overly planned either. They're just motifs that you anchor towards and expand upon.
There's no one else. Yeah. Hand back over to Jen. Oh, there is something.
Oh yeah, it's too much. It's too much. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering where some of really sort of rich. And I'm just wondering, is there an emotional source to some of that, or is it just based on the projects that you've chosen?
I mean, different bodies of work have different color stories. Like I certainly was like in previous, like last year, I was looking at even just taking still shots, screenshots rather, of film stills, and just like looking at the color palettes for, you know, different tonalities. So it's more about like the color story of each individual painting, you know, rather than like writ large. But for example, peacocking behind you, like my original intention for that work was to be like really high dramatic chiaroscuro, glowing peacocks in a very dark midnight purple. But because I get bored, and rather than like standardizing my practice from an earth palette and building academically, I do tend to complicate things and just kind of splash a lot of color around in my underpainting stage, and that kind of curtailed where this one was going, and it became this like candy, fantastical kind of scape. But like that's only by chance. That was not by design, for example. But like there's an aesthetic conceit of like in like shelf life behind us, like using that hyper aestheticism of like having everything in that kind of high saturated like tonal range that's like uncomfortable, and like that's part of the sickliness. So it's like there is a conceptual reason why the tones and palettes, rather than necessarily an emotional effect. It's got its rationale.
Thank you
Thank you.
everyone for being here, and thanks Karla so much for sharing. I really appreciate you. Well, even from an art background and those lines, it's really great to understand the work that allows us as viewers to sort of get in. Thanks, Alan, for all those great questions. It's been really good. Sad that this is the last one, but maybe we'll be more.
Yeah, there'll be something.
Something.
There'll be something.
So we will stay on now. Please thank Karla and thank you again. Thanks.
I think,
Good.